To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you. Your support truly makes this show possible, and we couldn't do any of this without you. If you value our work and you want to help us keep this project going, become a patron. We rely on listeners like you to sustain the show. Join at patreon.com/deathpanelpod and get access to weekly bonus episodes and our full back catalog with hundreds of hours of bonus content. And to help us out some more, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, hold reading or discussion groups, share the show with someone who needs to hear it, and of course, you can also follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm joined by returning guest and dear friend of the panel, Vicky Osterweil, who has graciously agreed to help me discuss some of what has happened while we were out on parental leave. Vicky is a brilliant author, worker, and agitator. She's the author of the 2020 book, In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. She writes about revolt, history, culture, anarchy, and technology as a founding member of CAW, a worker-owned anarchist journal of arts and culture. Her new book, called The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World, is forthcoming from Haymarket in spring of 2026. Vicky, welcome back to the Death Panel. As always, it's a true honor and pleasure to get the chance to have you on the show.
Oh my God, I was going to say how honored I am to be here for these 2 months/2 decades of U.S. history to discuss. So thank you so much for having me back. And congratulations again on Baby Death Panel. I can't wait to meet the little guy.
I'm so glad you're here. We've been calling this one the fascism check-in. And honestly, it feels like there's more than enough to warrant that title as like a kind of multi-part conversation at this point. Since we've been out on parental leave, a wave of stories have piled up, each more, disturbing than the last. ICE kidnapping protesters, the FBI arresting not just organizers, but judges, a proposed autism disease registry, new disability policy out of the Trump administration that reads like a greatest hits of American eugenics revisited. Then there's Dr. Mehmet Oz, now heading the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, declaring that it's a patriotic duty to not use healthcare and health insurance.
And it is your patriotic duty, I'll say it again, the patriotic duty of all Americans to take care of themselves, because it's important for serving in the military, but it's also important because healthy people don't consume healthcare resources.
Which, I know we joke that the mask is off and, it's just bold-faced eugenics, but this is just there isn't even a face anymore. It's just the machinery. But what has been anchoring me in all of this, what's helped me connect the dots between what might otherwise feel like orchestrated chaos, has been your recent writing, Vicky. Your last 2 essays on Rubicons Crossed and Fascism minus Kampf really name this moment with a kind of precision that's both horrifying, clarifying, but also actually kind of optimistic. And that's why I wanted to talk to you now, because the patterns are there. It's really easy to say, okay, this is just, history repeating itself. But it's important to think about it as not, predetermined, because if we're going to fight it, we need to be honest about what it is, but also honest about the kind of reality that inevitability plays in manufacturing consent for what's been happening. So much has happened over the last couple months that it feels almost impossible to hold it all at once. But when you step back and look at the arc of it, there's a clear pattern there. So before we get into some of the specifics, I just want to lay out the feeling of this moment. Coming back from parental leave, it felt like we returned to a terrain that had kind of shifted, not overnight, but kind of quietly, deliberately over the last 2 months. It's really changed a lot since we last spoke in December, especially as well. And what's striking is not just the volume of stories or events, but their interrelation. Protest repression, eugenic health policy, surveillance, targeting disabled people. None of this is new, but the shape that it's taken lately feels more emboldened, more cohesive, perhaps. So, Vicky, just to start us off, I want to begin by asking you kind of a difficult question here at the top, which is, what do you make of this moment as a kind of top line? What's the connective tissue that you're seeing here? What stands out to you in this cluster of events? And how do you make sense of what's shifted or consolidated or what hasn't since the beginning of the year?
Yeah, thank you. B, again, you started listing things, and before I came on, as I was prepping for this episode, I made a list, just everything I could think of off the top of my head. And it's 3 pages long of single space, just top line headlines. So maybe we'll get into some of that stuff. But so I think as folks who I'll be talking about some of the stuff. If you want more details on some of this, it's all there on CAW. I have been posting through it for sure. But I think I think as early as February 2nd, we had seen, or even February 1st, we had seen an official break with the American Constitutional Republic. I think when Elon Musk and Doge got access to federal payment systems, that was as good a moment as any to name. I think we are no longer living under the same regime that America has lived under since at the most recent 1873, or 1877, excuse me, in the end of Reconstruction, and at the furthest back, 1791, in the signing of the Constitution. I tend to think that there was also a break during the Civil War, and that the major propaganda of the Union victory was to declare that there was in fact continuity when there wasn't. But whatever. In any case, that's a different conversation.
Put a pin in that one.
Exactly. But similarly to that moment, I think it is possible still, although very slight. I think it is extremely unlikely, but I think it is still possible that something could happen that would restore at least some shadow of that constitutional republic in such a way that the people who restored it could claim continuity. I think that window has been closing. And, the essay I wrote on, I think, April 14th or 15th about crossing the Rubicon, that's obviously a symbol for the moment at which the crisis can no longer be undone. And I think we are looking at a fascist coup, a self coup, as it is sometimes called by people in the sort of, I guess, authoritarian studies business. We are witnessing the entire dismantling of the 20th century of progressive politics of any kind, the full and total defeat of the labor movement, the disabled movement, the civil rights movement, or at least that's what they think they're doing. They're filling sausage with sawdust again, and they're giving us measles and not telling us about it, and they are really excited for fully deregulated, like no more national forests, right? Trump openly evokes the 1870s, right? I think I spent 5 or 6 years sort of developing a sort of way of comparing this to the Gilded Age, and he just tweeted it out, kind of thing. I think there's a real attempt at the moment to use 21st century technology to return to a 19th century economic structure, late 19th century economic structure, with what you could arguably call sort of like 16th or 17th century political sovereignty, right? And like despotism, monarchical despotism. Although on all of those points, there's a lot of internal disagreement within the administration. And so I want to be really clear that I think we are living under fascism. I think that most of us had already, many of us had already been living under a form of fascism through mass incarceration, through the border policies, through reservations, obviously, the health and nursing home and education systems that exist now, right? I think there was a lot of fascism already in there, but there is no more of the veneer or indeed the victories won by our past comrades. Those are being stripped away as quickly as possible from the federal government. I think in one way, we're in a timeline to death camps. In another way, we already live with the camps. Biden had camps on the south border. What is the prison system, if not already? Concentration camps with nicer names hidden behind the word justice. Okay, that is part of a global far-right power grab that is taking obviously extreme inspiration and excitement from having control of America, the world's largest economy. And all of that is the moment. And I also think that the coup is failing. And I think it's falling apart. And I think the administration is doomed. There are a lot of different scenarios in which this regime falls apart. I think he could die. He could be couped. I think that there could be sovereign dissolution, breakdown into civil war. I think there could be a revolution, but I think it is headed towards, and this is, I think, sort of what forms the basis of some of those essays. It's going through a very, very fundamental contradiction right now, which is that it has proven extremely successful at achieving its aims on a policy level, while increasingly getting more and more politically isolated and less popular and creating more enemies. And that is a contradiction that is accelerating constantly. And that will lead to a confrontation of some kind or another. And I don't think Trump's got the people or the plan to successfully reconsolidate power. But maybe he will. Maybe he'll surprise me, which would be terrible. And there are other worse people around him who could also do the same. The fact that he falls from power is not, in fact, the only a good outcome necessarily. But that's where we are. So rising fascism globally and being run by one of history's most useless fools in a way that gives me a lot more I'm a lot less scared than I was when we last spoke in December. I'll say that.
Interesting. Well, I think that that's an important benchmark, you know, and really, like, I really appreciated Fascism minus Comp, where the sort of subtitle of that essay is, or our enemy confuses the map for the terrain, because you very much like lay out the argument in that essay about the kind of self-defeating terrain that you just were alluding to. You start by talking about accountability and the kind of way that Trump's accountable to no one, right? And this is part of his sort of character. But that right now there's been so many moments of like kind of pushing the envelope or alienating broad swaths of, you know, what could be his constituency. I think the attacks on Medicaid, for example, are going to prove to be powerful in terms of turning people against the regime. However, at the same time, what we do know about things like Medicaid is that the more sort of struggle that you're forced to go through as a recipient of these benefit programs when you lose them or when they're threatened, the less enfranchised you feel, the more administrative burden you're wading through. And so it does tend to also produce, you know, things like what's going on with Social Security, declaring, you know, thousands of people dead through a kind of broad clerical move overnight. Or, you know, attacks on Medicaid. You could easily see also at the same time this really contributing to people being like too exhausted to revolt. In my mind, that's the kind of variable that I'm most worried about here, right? Which is that, you know, it seems like on one hand, you know, constituencies are being turned against the regime. On the other hand, you know, how much is that the kind of fucking things up and breaking things going to result in people just being so kind of desperately concerned with their own immediate needs that they don't have the capacity beyond that right now, you know? But what you talk about in your essay is really, one, the kind of contradiction and this acceleration that you're talking about, but two, also really this kind of like affective part of what's going on in terms of like business confidence and how people are perceiving what's going on. And it really feels like while we were out, you know, the state has formalized a bunch of things that used to be sort of part of it. Maybe they were like norms, maybe they were just vibes or consequences built into the system, but then they've gone from things that used to be hidden to overt, you know, policy declarations. I think Dr. Oz's declaration of, you know, good citizens don't use their health insurance is a great example, right? For decades and decades, we have seen policy craft schemes that have made health access, quote unquote, this increasingly difficult and expensive gamble, right? Where, yes, on paper, we're trying to expand people's access to healthcare or health insurance, right? But at the end of the day, you know, this is an expansion of billing codes, or this is an expansion of subsidies to private insurance companies, right? Where really the undercurrent has been good citizens don't use their healthcare, but that hasn't been the kind of top line statement. And so we've kind of seen these like formalizations of things that were very much a part of the picture, but we're more, you know, like, for example, in the show, we've talked about them for a long time, but we've often had to go to great lengths to be like, no, this is what they're actually saying here. But now it's just like we've blinked and the performance of democracy or decency was sort of dropped mid-scene, right? And I guess your essay is helping me think about how fascism in the U.S., obviously, there isn't a moment of arrival, right? As you were saying, this is like a long-standing process, and there's also no arrival in a kind of goose step, right? There's no Leni Riefenstahl orchestrated spectacles. There's no movie like military parade. This is like arriving or more, I guess, developing or percolating in press releases, takeovers of data platforms, court decisions that are ignored, right? And this isn't a series of bad policies either. This is like achieving policy goals. This is governance by abandonment layered with militarization. And ultimately, what we're looking at is people realizing that we've always had a state that can kidnap you in broad daylight and can't guarantee that you have clean water.
That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And if you do name a point of arrival for fascism, which I agree doesn't make sense in the 20th century or 21st, it would be 1492, right? And like I think like ever since I saw it, I think I've been really, really obsessed with the chart that I shared from like Bloomberg commentator Joe Weisenthal, who made a chart of small business confidence, right? Where they responded, is it a good time to expand? And if you look at that chart from 2010 to the present, there is this massive, massive bubble during the Trump years, right? It goes up, I think I said 300 to 700% during the Trump years. And like, that explains, not to be too vulgar Marxist about it, but right, like the whole claim is that the petty bourgeoisie is the baseline of fascism, right? And like small business owners under the first Trump regime thought that they were living through the best economy they'd ever lived through, right? And now they're not because of tariff stuff. Well, okay, so that's going to go in one direction. But yes, I think the vibes. I think one of the things that's really important about the second Trump regime, as you're saying, is that they have decided that the problem was that they couldn't go mask off. They didn't go fast enough, hard enough in the first administration. So they got, Project 2025, and they're doing this sort of an Elon Musk and this sort of blitzkrieg strategy of, restarting the Keystone XL pipeline, opening up the seafloor for mineral extraction, blackbagging student activists, stripping student visas, like shutting down USAID, like, reorganizing the FBI, firing the whole Joint Chiefs of Staff. Like they're doing like these really, really massive changes all at once with the analysis, I think the incorrect analysis, that what happened in the first Trump administration was that they went too slow, and that like resistance from the Democrats and the sort of other Republicans sort of was too successful at slowing them down. But to zoom back, again, and like to respond to, I think, what you're saying, which is the worry about the apathy, which is, the scariest thing. If we don't rise up, like we're going to have to, like we're in a lot of trouble. Luckily, we already are. The media has been entirely captured by the far right, by billionaires. I mean, literally all of it, like top to like medium, maybe not all the way to the bottom, but like, even a lot of independent people write on Substack, right? Like it's just fully captured. And so there's not a lot of coverage of it, but there is massive protest going on right now. We are in the biggest wave of protests since 2020 right now in the US. A lot of it has been led by white liberals and middle class folks, which is why it hasn't yet broken containment and like totally shaken the foundations. But it has completely helped to destroy one of the largest corporations in U.S. history. Like, I don't think Tesla will ever recover, right? That's a real material targeting that happened that was, I think, extremely effective. I mean, I think it only accelerated a thing that already was happening, which was he was alienating his entire European and Chinese customer base, by being part of this government. But still, it really matters. And yeah, so the reason that I'm less pessimistic about that energy drain than I could be is because while we are in the midst of a global far-right power grab at the moment, that global far-right power grab, contra the sort of like anti-historical leftists who like pretend like, oh, there's no left movement, like they're doing fascism without a communist party or whatever, who just like refuse to see Black and Indigenous struggle as like real revolutionary power if it doesn't have a political representative in front of it. Like 2011, arguably, maybe 2009, 2008 to 2020 was a period of extreme revolutionary upheaval across the globe. And the US was, in fact, at the forefront of it a lot. All those people sort of saying, oh, why doesn't the US do this? Look how France goes. Like, we went way harder than France those 10 years. You know what I mean? Even before George Floyd. So we are in the beginning of a middle of an era of revolution. And I'm using revolution here in its broadest sense. So not in its most specific sense, which is like, or the more specific sense it's taken on since the fall of the Soviet Union, which is like the good liberatory thing that overthrows a bad government. Although I will use that definition also at times. But in this instance, I'm talking about that big definition of revolution, which is overturning, right? We are in a period of extreme state overturning right now. And we're in the middle phase of it. And I think that 2008 to 2020 was the first phase. And I think that the second phase was kicked off. I think you can basically date it to Al-Aqsa flood, but whatever, that's, again, this is sort of longue durée historical argument stuff. But we are again in a period of massive global struggle. And the US working class is more agitated and organized than it has been since the 60s. There are more people with a memory of direct immediate revolts that like had this same guy hiding under the White House.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.